Good evening. It is May. Oh, is it May 5th?
Hi.
Oh, Cinco de Mayo. But we are doing Introduction to Islam with our own Ben Zeller. And when you say our own, that means he's a congregant. And unbeknownst to him, he is volunteering and he is a wonderful speaker. We have him every year. I adore his presentation.
That's when I leave. No.
Don't say that. He is an American historian of religion and author who studies new religious movements. So not just Islam. We'll have to find some other. He's talked to us about cults and AI, a lot of interesting things. He is a professor and chair of religious studies at Lake Forest College, and he graduated with a BA in religious studies from the University of Rochester and received an MTS, I don't know what that is, from Harvard. He earned a PhD in religious studies from the University of North Carolina. All very, very interesting. And with no further ado, Ben, take it away.
Excellent. Thanks for having me. Everyone online, can you hear me? Yes? I'm assuming.
Yes.
Can't hear me? Tell me. Okay.
There you go.
So I'm not going to be watching the chat online. So if
I will watch the chat.
Excellent. Okay. So when I teach Islam, usually it's in the context of teaching World Religion Survey, and I have about maybe 2.5 weeks. So I'm going to try to condense into 1 hour the highlights of what normally I would spend several weeks talking about when I do teach it as sort of part of my survey.
Now this group would understand the Evelyn Wood course of Islam. Not all my groups get that.
The other thing to note when we talk about really any religion, but Islam in particular, is it's not a monolith. It's as diverse as any other religion. And I'll start with an anecdote, which is that I was teaching world religions at Temple University, where I taught for a while in Philadelphia. Very diverse student body. And I was in the Islam unit, and we were talking about Islamic laws and rules. And I was talking about the different rules for clothing. Of course, it's people probably know many Islamic women, Muslim women, wear head coverings and veils like that. So we were talking about rules for men, and I was noting that in a particular school of thought that men are supposed to cover their heads both when praying, but also when out and about. And a Muslim student in my class raised his hand and said, "No, that's not right." And another Muslim student raised his hand and said, "No, it's absolutely right." And I don't forget how long they went back and forth, but eventually another Muslim student said, "Well, it's sort of up to the person, isn't it?" Which is a wonderful encapsulation of how actually every religion works. But I love it, and I've gotten a lot of mileage out of that. As the time I was trying to teach Islam, and the Muslims in my class couldn't agree on the basics of how you're actually supposed to practice it, which is if anyone familiar with Judaism knows, I ask 5 Jews, I get 6 answers. So it's really, it's pretty common. And like Judaism, Islam is a very textual tradition. It has a tradition of scholars, a tradition of jurists. And so sometimes the differences come down to different schools of thought, sometimes formal schools of thought, interpretations about how you're supposed to practice. Other times it's idiosyncratic to cultural regions, to individuals, to families. So it's as diverse as any other religion. So I thought I'd start with just sort of some basics here. Oops, hold on, doesn't advance unless there we click. Islam is the second largest religion in the world behind Christianity. I haven't updated these slides in the last 6 months. I don't think it's gotten any bigger or smaller, but a little under 2 billion people versus about 2.5 billion Christians. So certainly smaller. It is the newest of the major monotheistic faiths, which would be Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Often when I teach, I include Baha'i as well, partially simply because where we are in Chicago. Baha'i is the daughter religion of Islam. I'm not going to say much more about it. It really merits its own day. But Baha'i has the same relationship to Islam that Islam has to Christianity, that Christianity has to Judaism. Each of them is a monotheistic faith that sees itself as developing out of the one that came before with sort of the new updates, so that what the next prophet has to say. Each of them also, of course, claims that its prophet is the last of them. So the term used in Islam is that Muhammad, who's the founder, is the seal of the prophets. Like if you're closing up a scroll and put a seal on it. So he's the last prophet. And of course, Christians would say that after Jesus, there was no more. And Jews would say after, well, I don't know where chronologically our last prophet is. Whoever the last one chronologically is in the prophets. Malachi, there we go. Whichever comes towards the end, that's what it ends. And so I just sort of put them all sort of in series in that way. In other words, Islam actually has a lot in common with Christianity and Judaism and Baha'i. So if you just sort of took a guess, often you get it right. So it's monotheistic. It has a text, believes in prophets, has a system of ethical rules, believes that God will judge you for how you live your life. Sort of all the things that are often sort of held in common by all these monotheistic religions came from the Middle East, has a sacred text written in a Middle Eastern language. Many of the things that we take for granted about Judaism are equally true of Islam as well, and to a lesser extent, Christianity and the Baha'i movement. You've probably heard of Muhammad, the founder of Islam, the prophet of Islam. We'll talk a bit about his life today. You've probably heard of the Quran. The Quran is the central text of Islam. It literally means the recitation, that is the spoken thing. And that has two sort of connotations to that. One is it is read aloud by Muslims as part of their practice, so it's recited. The other is it's believed by Muslims that it was recited to Muhammad from God or from God's angels. So it is the recitation from the divine to the prophet, and it's also the recitation that Muslims use when they pray. Not that Muslims can't read it silently, many do, but it's said to be, it is traditionally spoken aloud. And in fact, the form it takes is poetry. I am not enough of a poet to tell you what the details are, the style of verse or things like that is, but it fits within a standard sort of Arabic style of verse. So it's poetic. So when you hear it recited, it has a certain rhythm and a certain rhyme structure, and it sounds like the sort of thing which is meant to be spoken aloud. If I had a board, I would do sort of a Venn diagram. I often do this when I first start teaching it because there's often confusion between the terms Islam, Muslim, Arab, Arabic, Arabia. All these things are overlapping. In a very brief nutshell, Arabia is the place all this came out of, roughly analogous to what we would call the Saudi Arabia and bits of surrounding it, but the Middle East. Arabic is the language and also the adjective to refer to Arab people. Muhammad and all the early Muslims were Arabs, speaking Arabic. However, as Islam spread, they actually became the minority within the tradition. So most Muslims are not Arabs and are not native Arabic speakers. Anyone happen to know what the biggest Muslim country in the world is? Indonesia, you got it, yeah. And the largest ethnic group, which is the largest Muslim ethnic group?
Sunni.
Sunni and Shia are actually religious distinctions. I meant ethnicity. South Asian. So that would be like Bangladeshi, Pakistani, Indian. What's interesting, though, is much like Hebrew, Arabic is the sacred language. So even if you are a Bangladeshi Muslim or Indonesian Muslim, you certainly speak you're unlikely to speak any modern Arabic, but ideally you learn classic Arabic so you can read the Quran in its real language. Do all Muslims do that? Of course not. Any more than do all Jews learn Hebrew. Is that the ideal? Yes. If you are educated and of a certain class, do you do that? Yes. If you are a average everyday farmer who's just trying to survive, you're unlikely to learn more than a few words of Arabic, and you're likely to have to go to the mosque to hear it translated for you, or if you can afford, buy it in translation. The other terms I put up there, Sunni and Shi'i, these are the two major divisions, the religious divisions within Islam. We'll talk about them at the end, ideally, if we have enough time. They have all sorts of differences in practice. They're loosely tied to different ethnic groups as well. So of relevance for today, you all probably know the Shiites are associated with what major country that we're now we're not technically at war, I think, because we're on pause. We're on a hiatus, right? But the Iranians, of course, are the center of Shiite Islam. But there are Shia Muslims in Iraq, in parts of Lebanon, in Syria, and Afghanistan, Pakistan as well. Well, of course, migration all over, but those are sort of the hearts of it. So all that is to say, here are some terms we'll use. As I said, it's not working. There we go. As I said, when I teach this over 2 weeks, this is what I try to cover. There's no way we're going to get this all in one day, so in 1 hour. So I'm going to give you maybe, 10 minutes of each of these, and then we can take time for questions. So we'll start with Muhammad and the giving of the Quran in about 10 minutes. The founder of Islam is Muhammad. You can see this wonderful image over here, and perhaps that will raise a question for you about images. Who knows anything about Islam and images? There was a big deal at a university in Minnesota a couple of years ago about this.
They aren't supposed to have.
Yeah, you're not supposed to have images. Nevertheless, many Muslims do. I did not make this up. This is a illuminated copy of the Quran made by Muslims in Persia, modern day Iran, at a time when it was considered acceptable to have images of the Prophet. That is something that Muslims have been debating now for hundreds of years. The consensus now is that you should not. But the image here this is not the image I made. This is directly from a historical copy of the Quran with an image of the founding of the religion, which is traditionally dated to the month of Ramadan in approximately year 610 of the Common Era, when it is said the prophet Gabriel encountered Muhammad during a spiritual retreat that he went on. So without going too much into Muhammad's sort of personal biography, the context he's coming out of is what we call pre-Islamic Arabia. Which is a mix of, this is a 7th century of the Common Era. There are Jews, there are Muslims, so there's Mandeans. Mandeans are sort of an offshoot of Christianity that actually worships John the Baptist. If you know nothing about Christianity, Zoroastrians, which is an ancient religion out of Persia, as well as what we typically call pagans, that is polytheists, all operating primarily within different tribal groups. Some tribes were associated with sort of particular ones of these religions. Others had different people. And Muhammad is living in Mecca, which is the indisputable economic capital of the region. It's also a trading city. It's also a city where there's sort of enforced religious diversity. You don't want to have religious war when you're trying to run your economy. It's also the sacred center of Arabian paganism. That is, it's where there is this famous building, which still dates to, which is still around today, called the Kaaba. There's a slide later on with the picture, which is this sort of big black building, which was said at the time to have all of the statues of the various gods that are worshipped, much like a Greek or a Roman temple. It was filled with the various beings, and supposedly there was some Christian icons in there as well. I don't think there was a Torah scroll, but it wouldn't have been outside of the keeping of the people who were running Mecca. The idea was everyone was welcome in Mecca to come and trade. This was their shared religious center. This becomes a big point because part of what Muhammad does is he purges it of all that stuff and makes it a big empty room. Because like Judaism, there's the sense of rejecting iconography. But Muhammad goes on this spiritual retreat. He's raised sort of basically generically sort of Arabian pagan, with different gods, is exposed to Jews and Christians and other folks. He's on retreat, and while he's meditating, it is said that the angel Gabriel appears to him and says, recite. And he says, recite what? And he says, recite. And then what flows is sort of what's the first 5 verses in one of the chapters of the Quran. It's about recite that God has made humanity and that God has given learning to people. I'm paraphrasing here, but recite sort of this. And then over the next 22 years of his life, according to Muslim belief, the angel Gabriel, as well as God directly by voice, never in physical presence, but by sort of oral prophecy, reveals the rest of the text, which eventually gets written down as the Quran. It is a historical text in the sense of which it's unfolded over the course of the rest of his lifetime, over 20 years, as things happen in his life and among the early community which is forming around him. The prophecies respond to that. The content responds to that. So, for example, one thing you find if you read the Quran cover to cover is you see sort of these weird juxtapositions of sometimes the prophecies are calling for sort of this peaceful coexistence with other religions. Other times it's calling for basically open warfare. And you can trace that to basically what's going on at the time. When the early Muslims are getting along with the other folks around them, often you have these very sort of peaceful prophetic statements. When there's open warfare, then what you get is basically the same thing. Again, this is analogous to if you read the Hebrew Bible cover to cover, you could find, beautiful, verses about, beat your swords into plowshares. You can also find commands from God to go slaughter the inhabitants of the land. So it is like Judaism, it's except compressed. It's over 22 years as opposed to the hundreds of years that it took for the entire Tanakh to be composed and produced. Nevertheless, it's as diverse. I just talked about the stuff. After his death, all of the prophecies are compiled. So Muhammad himself was not literate. He
Not know that.
Yeah, he was not literate. He was able to read ledgers and things like that. So I shouldn't say he was illiterate. He had no book learning. He could read a ledger. He was a trader. He was a merchant. So if you presented him with numbers, he could read that. But he was not the sort of person who was likely to sit down and write down entire verses. His followers did that, though. And after his death, Abu Bakr, who was his successor and also his stepfather, collected sort of all the different scraps and scrolls and versions of everything Muhammad said and convened a council and basically sorted through them and created the authoritative version of the Quran and had all the other parts which didn't make it destroyed. This is much like, early Christianity, the Council of Nicaea did the same thing. Of course, some little scraps survived, dig them up in the desert and things like that. So the Quran itself has 114 chapters called surahs. In addition, Abu Bakr and other early Muslims collected all of the stories about Muhammad and wrote them all down in what's called hadith. The hadith are sort of like the Mishnah, if the Mishnah were not about the rabbis, but about like the prophets. Like it's a story of all the things Muhammad said to his friends and his colleagues and how Muhammad prayed and things like that. So for example, the Quran calls for Muslims to pray. It doesn't say how to pray though. So for that, Muslim scholars would go to the hadith and say, here are the people who observed how Muhammad prayed. If it's good enough for Muhammad, it's good enough for us. But the Quran doesn't actually have those details. Again, much like the Hebrew Bible, you need to go to the Mishnah and the Talmud to figure out what's actually how you do this stuff. So that's their hadith. Hadith were actually sorted into three baskets. There was the basket of definitely authoritative. There was the basket of maybe authoritative, and there was the basket of interesting, but don't follow it. You don't want to toss the legends, but you don't necessarily need to follow them. So you'll find all sorts of fascinating hadith about Muhammad flying around and, shooting light rays and things like that. And those are put in like the less authoritative ones. Whereas the ones about, 20 people observed how Muhammad prayed when he went to this particular site. And, there were 20 eyewitnesses who were living there, and talking about it. That gets put in the authoritative one. So that's the sort of the life of Muhammad. We could say a lot more about him, but what is the content of the prophecies? Glad you asked. This is a good example. This is the prologue. If you open a Quran, this is the very first one. Allah is simply the Arabic word for God. Jews and Christians who speak Arabic as their native language use the same word for God. So if you're a native Arabic speaking Jew, instead of saying, I don't know, you'd say Allah. It's the same. It just means God. So all praise to Allah, to God, Lord of the worlds, most beneficent, ever merciful, King of the day of judgment. You alone we worship, and to you alone turn for help. Guide us, O Lord, to the path that is straight, the path of those you have blessed, not of those who have earned your anger, nor those who have gone astray. So you can find in here some of the core teachings of Islam. This was not the first hadith. This is not the first, the first surah in terms of chronology, but it's the first one in terms of the text. When they were putting the Quran together, this one was seen as encapsulating all the really important themes. And so they chose to put this one in the front. After this, they go in roughly order of length. So the longest ones are at the beginning and the shortest ones are at the end. But this one they chose to put at the beginning. That's because it has the central themes: monotheism, the idea of justice, that there's the straight path that you should follow, that God will judge you for how you act, that God is good, merciful, beneficent, but that one has to sort of live one's life in the right way. These are the basis of Islamic belief. So what happens? I suppose I should, let me take questions at the end, actually. Otherwise, I'm going to totally run out of time. So what happens? Muhammad is able to, over these 22 years of his life, while he's receiving these prophecies, convince a bunch of people that he's not nuts. Some people think he is nuts, to be entirely clear. And actually, the Quran talks about this, and the Hadith talk about this. People who say that, he was a liar, or he was a fraud, or he was mentally disabled. And certainly there were those who said that. But enough people thought that he was both sane and truly touched by God, that a small community forms around him. Some of those early converts were actually Christians and Jews, other monotheists. Most of them were what we would call sort of pagans. They were polytheists. The basic argument that Muhammad offered was that God would not leave the Arabs out. Just as God came to the Jews, just as God came to the Gentile West, that is the Greeks and the Romans and such, so too would God come to the Arab people to bring the message of monotheism and to bring sort of prophecy. So the basic idea from the onset was Islam should be able to coexist with Christians and Jews. After Christians and Jews, by and large, rejected him, Islam has a much more tense relationship with the other monotheistic traditions, begins to see itself much more explicitly as replacing them as opposed to augmenting them. Theologically speaking, they're incompatible. Theologically speaking, both Judaism and Christianity would claim that prophecy ends with them. And so to claim there's another prophet, there's always going to be a theological problem. But at least initially, there's an attempt to sort of play nice. And in fact, there were Jews and Christians who allied with early Muslims, seeing them as sort of religiously compatible. One of the first things he does when he establishes sort of the small community is one of the first things that happens to them, I should say, is they get kicked out of Mecca and they go what's called the Hijra, which is the journey where they go to Medina, where they're welcomed and they're put in charge of Medina, and Medina becomes the first Muslim city. And so they're able to establish how they're going to run a society if they're in charge. Islam grows, it grows out of Medina, more of the travel groups convert, and eventually they decide that they're going to march on Mecca and take it over. And the leaders of Mecca surrender because they have a smaller army and because ultimately they were a mercantile city, not a military city. And they were happy to, or willing to convert to keep the peace. So the Muslims come into Mecca, and famously they engage in the purging of the Kaaba. So that's that stone building. Normally you don't see it with the black up. It looks on most pictures like a big black building. It's a stone building, but there's a black drape that goes around it. So they go in there. They take out all the idols and the icons to all the different gods, throw them away, destroy them, and leave it as a big empty room to symbolize their rejection of idolatry and their rejection of polytheism. After Muhammad dies, there's a disagreement over who should take over after him. And this is the beginning of the Sunni Shiite split. But it actually traces all the way back to the origins in terms of these competing factions within early Islam. There were some who called, even during Muhammad's lifetime, for conquering more cities. So they've started with Medina. They were invited there. They go to Mecca. They march on it. Mecca surrenders. It's basically a bloodless war. But there were other actual fights that took place among other sort of groups that did not want to surrender. And so there's a debate even early on in Islam, but should Muslims proactively go into holy war, what is traditionally labeled jihad, in order to spread the religion, or should they not? One of the elements of the split has to do with how proactively they should do that, and also whether it is appropriate to use military force against other Muslims. So among Shiites, one of their most important holidays is a commemoration of the day when they actually lost a battle to their Sunni opponents. Because the consensus from eventually most of the Sunni leaders was that Shiites were heretics, and therefore it was appropriate to turn religious war against them. So these splits happen almost immediately. And I'm not going to go into the details. It's super fascinating. I spend an entire day when I teach on this. It gets super complicated in terms of there's a lot of politics. There's also a bunch of economics. There's also a bunch of family drama that had to do with whether people were allying with Muhammad's with his in-laws or with sort of the existing sort of factions that were in charge. All sorts of wonderful drama here. Actually, I bring this up sometimes when I teach. This will seem like a tangent. I teach American religion when I teach on the formation of Mormonism. After Joseph Smith died, the same thing happened.
Yeah.
You had some people followed his family, and some people followed the appointed successor, Brigham Young. So that's why you end up having splintering of Mormonism. Very, very common for this to happen with new religions. You have sort of the fragmenting after the founder dies. All right. Let's talk about what Muslims do, and then we can take questions and talk about sort of some more of the details. We can always come back to some of the stuff. Click. Here we go. Click. How many of you heard of the 5 pillars of Islam before? You haven't heard of the 5 pillars of Islam? That's one of the traditional ways it's often taught. These are the 5 central practices of Islam, shared in common by all Sunnis and many Shiite Muslims as well. The largest group of Shiite Muslims, that is what are called the Twelvers, which is the largest group in Iran. That's what the Ayatollah is and was, and his group. They actually have 7 pillars. And there's some other groups with different numbers. But the 5 pillars of Islam is sort of a nice way to get to the basics of what pretty much all Muslims have in common. And we'll talk about the 5 of them. And then if we have time, I'll mention what the Shiite ones are as well that are different. So the first of them, and I should note this is not just a thing scholars do. This is an internal way that Muslims have of talking about their faith. So if you go to Muslim Sunday school, if you're a little Muslim kid growing up here in Chicago, you'd probably have a 5 pillars day where, in 2nd or 3rd grade, where your teacher says, what are the 5 pillars? Let's put them up on the board and we'll go through them. So this is an internal Muslim, at least among the Sunni. So the first of them is the Shahada. Which is the declaration of faith. And the easiest way for me to explain it is it's the Shema. It's the Shema for Muslims. It's used in the same way it's used in prayer. Traditionally, it's the first thing you say to a baby when it's born and the last thing you say before you die. It is said 5 times during the day, during formal prayers. It is the rallying call with the basics of the religion. And you see the entire thing up there. There's no God but God. And Muhammad is the messenger of God. That's what it says. So it's a statement of monotheism, a statement of prophecy, and a statement that Muhammad is the prophet. The traditional understanding within Islam is that to simply say this with intent is all it takes to convert to Islam. So unlike Judaism, you have to ask 3 times and be turned down before you're let in. In Islam, all you have to do is say this and you're in, which is interesting. This marks Islam, like Christianity and like Buddhism, as an evangelizing religion. It was all about spreading its faith. Judaism, Hinduism, Zoroastrianism do not seek converts. Occasionally will accept them, but don't go out and try to get people. So therefore, it's harder to convert. Buddhism, for Buddhism, you just have to accept the 3 jewels. Very, very simple. For Christianity, you have to, depending on what sort of Christian you are, accept a creed, a creedal statement. For Islam, you just have to accept the Shahada. So that's what you take to get in. Don't worry about saying it. You're not a Muslim. You have to mean to do it. So you can't become an accidental Muslim. But the text up there is a beautiful calligraphy of it. You often see this if you know the flag of Saudi Arabia. It's the Arabic text on the flag of Saudi Arabia is the Shahada. I believe the current Afghani flag is as well. I mean, I'm not sure post-Taliban takeover if they kept it. I think they did, but and I want to say Bahrain as well has it as well, but several Muslim countries have this right on their flag. It's been stamped on various coins produced by different Muslim countries over the centuries. It's a central theological claim. It's also a religious liturgical practice. It's also sort of a beacon of identity. Think of it as not just the Shema, but the Shema combined with the Star of David. So if you see a Muslim with sort of a pendant around their neck, it might have the crescent. The crescent is also sort of a symbol of Islam, but more likely it's going to be the Shahada. Salat is the second of the five pillars, and it means formal liturgical prayer. Muslims can pray whenever they want. Much like Christians or Jews or Buddhists or Hindus or whatever. But they're required by the Quran to pray 5 times a day. There's a wonderful hadith about this, where Muhammad has this sort of heavenly vision, where he journeys to heaven. It's unclear if he's physically going to heaven or sort of, mentally goes to heaven, but he's having a conversation with the angels, and they're discussing how often Muslims should pray. And they say, well, Muslims should pray 3 times per day because who else prays 3 times per day? Jews, right? So the angels say Muslims should pray three times a day. And Muhammad said, no, that's enough. Give us a few more. And the angels say, well, 4. He says, no more. 5. He says, okay, that's good. So according to the hadith, the 3 is what the angels were going to go for. But he ups it to 5. The trick is for most Muslims, number 3 and 4 of the day are actually combined. So you end up you usually pray 4 times a day because you combine them into one. Not all Muslims. Some actually have them separate as well. So this can take anywhere between, depending on what sort of tradition you're part of and how fast you speak, anywhere from 5 minutes to 20 minutes, depending on the day of the week. So Friday prayers are longer. The day of what part of the day there is. The morning prayers are longer than the afternoon prayers. Of course, also there's distinctions between different cultural reasons in terms of how you physically move your body. So you see up there the bowing. Different Muslims have different physical motions as part of the prayers. So some you have to stand and bow and move quite a bit more. Others you're doing it less. So obviously you can do it faster. So it just depends. But I've had a Muslim student say told me they could pray in 5 minutes, and others say no, it should take half an hour. So I would say 5 minutes is probably pretty short, but it's certainly possible. I don't have a translation in front of me, but actually, if you Google it, you could find the translation. The 5 are all slightly different depending on what time it is of the day, and also depending on what sort of Muslim you are. But basically, they're excerpts from the Quran with sort of filler connections. But it's basically all Quranic text. Developing out of this is the mosque, which literally means the place where you bow down. Muslims are not required to go to the mosque. Except for Friday, it is encouraged to pray communally. That gets interpreted as you should go to the mosque. But you're not a bad Muslim if you don't. You're supposed to find other Muslims and pray together on Friday. So, for example, at Lake Forest College, where I teach, Muslim students will often gather together Friday in sort of a little room. It's a break room. Which they use, and it's not unfortunate, not bad they don't go to a mosque. It's just they're following the idea they're supposed to convene together. But in a city where you have a majority Muslim population, you end up having mosques built in neighborhoods as places to congregate for the communal prayers on Friday afternoon. Developing out of this is also then the tradition of the prayer leader, who is the imam. In the Sunni tradition, the imam means the prayer leader. In the Shiite tradition, imam means something entirely different, which we're not going to get into right now. But the imam is the prayer leader, and I have my friend Hazem is the prayer leader at the Islamic Cultural Center, which is the one down on it's sort of between Dundee and Kingston, yeah. So he's down there. And so I brought students over there on field trips before. And he would say his job is it's a mix of being a scholar and having to do basically the equivalent of the Devar Torah. So here's the prayers are always the same, but he gets to choose which surah are we going to read today. So we're all going to pray the same way every day. It's the same prayer, but here's the surah, here's the chapter we're going to read, and I'm going to talk about. So it's a little more freedom as opposed to the rabbi who's stuck with the liturgical cycle, right? So he would say that part of his job is to be sort of a scholar, and he went to a training facility for that in Bosnia, where he's from. But as Azam would also say, part of his job is also to counsel families about, loss and death, couples getting married, to help, people whose kids are in trouble at school, all the stuff that ministers and rabbis throughout the world typically do. As Hazem has said to me, in the US in particular, imams come to function much more like ministers and rabbis, but even in Bosnia, where he was from, because Islam developed in tandem with, out of Christianity and Judaism, early imams looked to what priests and rabbis were doing, and later ministers after the Reformation, and in many ways modeled their behavior on what these other religious leaders were doing. So there were plenty of imams who basically looked to what rabbis were doing and said, this is how you lead a community. It's through scholarship, it's through prayer, it's through sort of guidance of individuals. That also means, therefore, that imams and mosque practices throughout the world tend to look different. Because, again, Islam was in some ways mimicking or following the pattern set of other monotheistic religions. In parts of Europe, as Islam moved in, practices look more like Christianity than in parts of Asia, where it was being compared to basically paganism. Muslims coming into Afghanistan and Pakistan and India don't want to emulate what Hindus and Buddhists are doing because they think that they're heretics, whereas Muslims coming into Greece and Bosnia and Turkey were much more willing to say, well, we can incorporate what Jews and Christians are doing as well in terms of the architecture, in terms of how our leaders are functioning, in terms of how we're operating in society. So that's a mosque, and that's salat, formal prayer. The third of the pillars is zakat. Zakat is a cognate to the Hebrew word tzedakah. There is confusingly another Arabic word, tzedakah, which is a direct cognate to the Hebrew word tzedakah. Tzedakah means in Arabic exactly the same thing it means in Hebrew. It is a charitable act, and it's based on the same root, which literally means, is it righteousness in some way?
Righteousness. I call it righteous giving.
Right, yes.
But
I forget what the root is. The Arabic root's exactly the same as the Hebrew root. So tzedakah is, if a Muslim says they're giving tzedakah or doing tzedakah, they mean the exact same thing we do. Zakat, which again is sort of, it's from the same root. Zakat is a tithe. So it's a fixed tithe, and it depends on what sort of Muslim you are. And here we should note, there are technically 7 schools of jurisprudence. So just as Judaism has our own internal divisions, so we have, as you know, we have the Babylonian and the Jerusalem Talmud. We have all the different rabbis within each of them who are all giving different readings. But typically in Judaism, over our thousands of years, it's coalesced into, we have Ashkenazic rites and Sephardic rites, right? So and Mizrahi rites and things like that. In Islam, there are 7 distinct ways of doing Islam, basically. So this is one of the places where it actually varies the most. When it comes to prayer, pretty much all Muslims can pray together. Sometimes they're going to stand or sit at different times or have slightly different words. It sounds like prayer. Zakat totally differs. It differs in terms of whether your tithe is based on your income or your possessions, whether it's based on your gross or your net. Whether you calculate it based on if you are it's different if you're a herder or a farmer, if you're a merchant or a producer. So all the rules differ. And what I put up there is whenever I teach this in my world religious class and I have Muslims in the class, I know this is going to be one of the longest digressions because someone will always raise their hand and say, well, my parents said this, this, and this. Because, because I've had Muslim students who are doing work study, they're getting a paycheck for $200. They want to know, what do I do? For some Muslims, they have an adjustable gross income where, you don't pay it for your first X amount of money. For others, you do. So it just varies. But the whole idea is, though, that it is incumbent on everyone, except unless you're truly impoverished, to be giving back for the good of the community. The one exception I think all Muslims have in common is if you are a recipient of zakat, you're not necessarily, you're often no longer bound to have to give zakat. So if you have been, for example, good example is if you were a victim of an earthquake, there were a bunch of earthquakes, I think, in Afghanistan. One way in which zakat was distributed was people went there to help rebuild, things like that. So the year you receive zakat from someone, you don't have to pay zakat. That would be very, very strange. But as soon as you're on your feet, you're no longer receiving aid, then you have to start giving it back again. Again, there are all sorts of wonderful rules about this. Muslim jurists love debating this as much as rabbis do, right? So they have their equivalent of the Talmud debating who should or shouldn't have to, what if you're given zakat, but then you win the lottery the next day? I mean, all these sort of weird rules. And you can tell when you read this stuff how much fun these jurists were having with these hypothetical, bizarre situations. You're impoverished, you're living on the streets, but the next day a herd of cows arrives and you're given ownership. How many cows do you have to give? It's that sort of stuff. But zakat is the tithe. Sayyim is the Ramadan fast. That is the fourth of the pillars of Islam. Islam has a lunar calendar, just like Judaism, but Islam does not intercalendrate. That is the technical word for what we do when we add a leap month. They do not. So the Muslim calendar is always moving through the year, such that every year, because it's shorter, it's 12 lunar months. Every Ramadan is a little earlier in the solar year every year. It is a fast from sunup to sundown. This is, again, an interesting example of the hadith where it is recorded that early Muslims actually looked to what Christians and Jews were doing. Jews on Yom Kippur and other fasts, and Christians during Lenten fasts, to figure out how they should do this. So, for example, it doesn't actually say in the Quran all the details what the fast is required, but it looks very much like a Yom Kippur fast, except that it is sun up to sundown. And it includes no food, no drink, no sexual activity, no smoking. Again, it looks very, very similar to Yom Kippur because the early Muslims looked to say, if you're a good monotheist with the Prophet, how do you fast? Those people over there are doing it. Let's ask them. So the hadith attests to that. As the slides point out, there were all sorts of fasts that predate this as well. And in fact, it said that Muhammad himself was fasting on the day he first received the Quran. Fasting is a common religious observance across many traditions. So for many Muslims in the first decades of Islam as it was starting, this was not seen as something weird. This was seen as sort of a continuation of ways in which you could be religious. What are you supposed to do? Much like Yom Kippur, for example, I don't know what you all, but when I was a kid, I was always told that Yom Kippur was a good day to go to the food pantry and donate food because you're not eating that day, so you give the food. You would be eating to the food pantry. I don't know if that was idiosyncratic to my synagogue growing up, but many Muslims do the same thing. So the idea is, whatever you're not spending on your lunch that day, you should go and donate that or give money to the hungry or things like that. Traditionally, Ramadan is a time for prayer, for introspection. There are, during the last week of Ramadan, some Muslims will engage in all-night prayers and things like that. The Sufis, who are the mystics, they're the ones who are doing this. Your average person who has a job is not gonna fast all day and pray all night because you'd have a tough time, teaching class the next day. But if you're a mystic, or someone particularly prone to religious practice, there's all sorts of ideals about praying all night and studying all day during your fast. So all sorts of cool culinary traditions tied to this. The iftar, you probably heard of the iftar. Iftar is the break fast. That's all it means, break fast. And again, in actual practice, it's fascinating. The foods are often the same foods that Jews and Christians would use as well. So like the famous Lebanese cookie, which is often used for breaking fast. It's a date cookie, but it's the same thing that Jews and Christians use as well for their break fasts. And which one came first? Those are quite literally fighting words in Lebanon, so we're not going to get in there. But it's they're all the same practices. Same with I was actually reading a fascinating article about Moroccan Jews and Moroccan Muslims break their fast with the exact same soup. And it's which one came first? Again, people will fight endlessly over that, but it's the same biological need, right? To sate yourself but not get too sick after you're fasting. Hajj is I think that's the last of them, unless I've lost track. This is the formal pilgrimage to Mecca. This is the requirement, according to the Quran and the Hadith, is that every Muslim should do this. However, the Hadith note that not every Muslim can do this. So until the modern era, very few Muslims would do this because it was very expensive, very dangerous, and required a certain amount of leisure time. If you were a subsistence farmer and Ramadan is during the middle of the harvest season, there is no way you're going to go. I'm sorry, Ramadan, Hajj. There's no way you're going to go on Hajj, to pilgrimage to Mecca. So if you are able to go on Hajj or pilgrimage, you should. Traditionally, entire sort of communities would get together and they would fund one person to do it. Now, if you want to go to Hajj, there are all sorts of businesses down in Chicago. If you've actually driven down, like Devon, the old Devon Avenue, the old Jewish neighborhood, now has a lot of Muslim travel agents there who will cater to getting you Hajj flights. They get you the visas. They set up the entire tour. The way you go on Hajj is actually super fascinating. Everyone who goes there, you have to change into a pilgrim's outfit when you arrive. It's all the same, regardless of your gender, your ethnicity, your culture, your social class. Everyone wears the same clothing, and you do the same thing, supposedly. This is Saudi Arabia being what it is, yes, you can certainly pay your way for a better experience. The Saudis are nothing if not corrupt, but traditionally it's supposed to be the great leveler. All people go here and all experience the same thing. You could be going on Hajj with a rich person and a poor person next to each other from, different cultures, different languages, different ethnicities, different genders. Everyone does the exact same thing. There's a formal way you do it. You walk around the Kaaba here, I think it's 7 times. Then you there's a particular hill you go to, you symbolically stone Satan. There's sort of a pillar where you throw stones at, and you're symbolically stoning Satan. You go back and forth in a repetition of the Muslims believe that the Prophet Abraham and Hagar and his beloved son Ishmael. So it's very similar to our story, except replace Isaac with Ishmael, that they're running around looking for a particular well. And so you go to a place where this well was found. So you're sort of stepping where Abraham and Hagar and Ishmael had stood thousands of years ago. So you're sort of recommitting yourself and reliving the ancient days of early Islam and even the prophetic period before that. Again, much like Christians would go on the Via Dolorosa, like, the crucifixion walk in Jerusalem, or a Jew might go to the Wailing Wall, right? So you go to the sacred place and do the sacred things. When I teach this, one of the things we often read is we read the recollections of Malcolm X about when he went on Hajj, and he talks about how he was sitting there and he had come to believe that white people were the devil and white people were horrible, but he's sitting there with white people and brown people and black people and Asian people and has this sort of profound experience where he sees we're all the beloved children of God. And you can take it what you will, but it's sort of a profound experience. He also has one where he talks about seeing all the trash that's like left around and how upset he is seeing that the trash that's left around and how angry he is that the Saudis have, commercialized this whole thing. So I like to use that because it shows the living nature of this tradition. So those are the 5 pillars. I think we have 10 minutes left, so I will I'm going to skip over all of the stuff. I'll just put the little picture up there. I'll give you 1 minute of Sufism, which is Sufism is Islamic mysticism. Comes out of Turkey. That's a picture of the whirling dervishes. They meditate through sort of this circular dancing where they're chanting dhikrs. Dhikr is a commemoration of God. It's basically a prayer. These are poetic sort of prayers that you meditate on. There's other forms of mysticism as well, but Sufism is the most famous. There's all sorts of saints in Islam, and if you go to Egypt, or it used to be in Iran and Iraq before all the wars, there were all sorts of little shrines where some famous Muslim saint had done something, and people would go there. And much like Catholicism, you're not supposed to pray to the saint, but you pray to God and hope the saint is listening as well, because the idea is the saint's up in heaven, you're God. So a saint can't do something for you, but a saint, if you pray to God and ask the saint to help, the saint can help you. So it's, again, actual Muslims, actual Catholics, pray to saints, but you're not supposed to. The idea is you're praying to God. I should note also, that is why Muslim fundamentalists, when they take over, one of the first things they do is blow up these shrines. So when the fundamentalists took over in Iraq,
the Taliban.
The Taliban in Afghanistan, they blew up all these shrines because they were seen as heretical. I'll end with jihad.
Wait. What about halal? Just very quick.
Yeah, we skipped right over it. Oh, it's right there. Halal is just means literally means kosher. It means okay to eat.
I know, but do they like kosher? Do they slaughter the animals in a different way, or?
Yes. So this depends on which of the 7 different schools of Islamic thought there are. All of them require abstaining from pork, and all of them require sacrificing the animal, saying a prayer, and therefore making it not a slaughter but a sacrifice. And so you say a prayer to God, and symbolically you're offering the animal to God, and then we are eating the remains. But with a single knife cut to minimize suffering.
Kashrut.
So it's just like kashrut. And there's a reason is that they look to kashrut as a model. So again, one of my favorite hadith is because the Quran doesn't give details about what is or is not a clean animal to eat. There's this case of where these early Muslim jurists went to the rabbis and said, tell us what you do and what we shouldn't do. And they said, well, it's not just pork, you can't eat shrimp. And one school of Muslims said, okay, we can't eat shrimp. And another school of Muslims says, no, we live on the coast. We're going to eat shrimp. So if you're from like Yemen, for example, the school of jurisprudence there permits shrimp, as shrimp is halal. Another school of thought within Islam says shrimp is haram. It is forbidden. Why? Because they looked at what the Jews were doing. So that's halal. Anything kosher is halal, but not vice versa. Anything kosher is halal. They do not have the milk meat separation requirements. It really comes down to a food either is or is not halal. And if it's allowed to eat, it's halal. If not, it's haram. I should note this gets into the weeds very, very quickly, where you have modern Muslims. In fact, a student once in a class just said, well, if it's a factory farmed animal which has suffered, it doesn't matter how the slaughter was. If it's suffered its entire life, that can't be halal. I'm not going to eat it. But that is not literally what the requirements say.
I think Jews would say, there's some Jews who would say that as well about kashrut.
And that's again, it's a living tradition. So you find. And then also you find plenty of Muslims who eat bacon. I mean, so it's no different from any other religion. Jihad I put up there because it's always sort of I get to it last. It's like the third rail, right? So it's literally means struggle. And according to Sunni tradition, there's an inner and an outer one. And the inner jihad is the inner struggle with sort of oneself. And the outer jihad is the struggle against heretics and those who were oppressing the Muslim communities, and sort of that's the holy war sort of thing. For Shiites, it is much more of the latter. We should note there's hundreds of years of history of Sunnis and Shiites slaughtering each other. So jihad actually is initially used by the Shiite communities against other Muslims. Long before it's used against Christians and Jews, jihad was the holy war of Shiites against Sunnis. Sunnis have always been a little more hesitant to use jihad in the sense of holy war. Not that they won't, But it still has much more of that inner struggle tradition. And of course, today, post 9/11, for many Muslims, they would just prefer not to talk about it at all as a concept. So when I get up thinking about my friend and colleague Hazim, who teaches this, and he's always, he hates teaching on this because it's one of those concepts he wished was not in the tradition. Because how do you teach about this? And for him, it is certainly about sort of the inner struggle, but he would prefer simply not to use the word. I said I'd leave 10 minutes for questions. I left 4 minutes for questions. But I think given that I normally do 2 weeks, this was pretty good.
It was excellent.
6 minutes.
Yeah.
If yes, please.
You mentioned that a lot of the communal prayers happen on Friday.
Friday, yeah.
Which leads me to say, is there an Islamic equivalent to Shabbat with a prescription of certain activities, day of rest, things like that?
Culturally and legally, yes. According to Quranic requirements, no. That comes out of the Hadith in terms of what are you supposed to do. So this is from memory. There is a Hadith where Muhammad talks about because you need to go pray on Friday, you're supposed to give your workers off so that they can go and prepare themselves and get clean. You can't pray in a dirty state, I should know. So you have to clean yourself. So you're supposed to, this comes from a society, where it's before running water, right? So, the one time you take a bath or a shower is Friday before you pray. So there is a hadith where Muhammad says you should let all your workers off on Friday so they can prepare for it. The Quran does not say thou shalt observe a day of rest in the same way Judaism does. I know that in some Islamic majority nations, there are sort of legal requirements as well, where stores have to be closed and things like that. So actually, Indonesia, I think stores have to be closed during the hours of prayer. I don't know when they start, actually. I could probably look it up with the help of Google Translate. What are the hours that are random? What is the hours of Best Buy in Indonesia? I'm going to guess it closes at around 1 or 2 on a Friday, maybe noon. Yeah. So
Thank you.
but not Saturday. It's not a whole day. It's just Friday.
How did Indonesia and Malaysia become so the growth of Islam not that far away from Saudi Arabia?
One of the really savvy and interesting things that Islam did is it spread via trade routes, much like Buddhism as well. So some of the requirements of Islam involve doing fair business. So a Muslim merchant has to follow certain rules, which include things like, today actually they can't charge interest. There's ways around that, but limiting interest. You're not supposed to lie. You're not supposed to cheat. There's all sorts of ways in which a Muslim merchant could be seen by others as more reputable and more trustworthy, and someone you more likely want to do business with. So there was an impetus to convert and to join sort of these. It's almost like a Hanseatic League, if you know the history of the spread in Europe of the Hanseatic League, of these sort of you have a trade networks of people who are the same religion, who speak, if not the same language every day, at least can read the same language in the text and therefore can have shared contracts, can basically trust each other. And ultimately, I suppose if you're a Muslim merchant who's committed a sinful offense like lying or fraud, you could go to the imam and say, hey, that person is committing a religious offense. And you could go to the religious courts and not just the civil courts as well. And a person could be excommunicated and basically, told they're going to go to hell. So
It was trade routes.
trade routes. All that is trade routes. Trade routes.
Can you give us the 2 or 3 differences between Sunni and Shia?
Yes. So the Shia believe in a continuation of inspired leadership. I'm very careful not to say prophecy. They would say Muhammad was the last prophet. Nevertheless, the imams who follow, and they use the word imam to refer to these inspired leaders, are receiving not revelation, but divine guidance.
Kind of like a Rebbe?
Yeah, like a Rebbe, yeah. So actually the Ayatollah, who was just killed, of course, and replaced with another one, is said to be not quite at the same level because he's a step down, but also receives sort of divine guidance. But before the Ayatollahs, there were the imams, and the imams were basically like the Rebbes. The Sunnis saw this as heresy, and the Shia saw them as their sacred leaders. The Sunni killed the first couple of them in these holy wars, which led to then, after you kill other people, religious leaders, the community split pretty quickly. And then they got tied into different ethnic groups and different cultural groups, different political and economic groups. But that's the main difference is the imams for Shiites. And Shiites are internally divided over whether there were 5, 7, or 12 of them. So some say after the first 5 were valid and the 6th one and after were invalid imams, and some say 7 and some say 12. And the 12ers are the biggest. So that's the biggest. Oh, the pillars. Most Shiites would say there's 7 pillars. Jihad is a pillar, and I gotta go back to my slides. What's the other one? For the 12ers, I think it's purity, and the 7ers, I think it's devotion. I don't recall, but there's 7 pillars for I think both 12ers and 7ers. They don't match though, so they're not the same 7, but they're sort of close. So yeah, the number of pillars, the role of the imams, and I would say millennialism or messianism. Sunnis, like mainstream Christians and Jews, all believe there'll be a day of judgment. But you don't expect it. It's not going to be in our lifetime. It's not, you're not, waiting for it to happen. Shiites have been expecting the end in their generation for hundreds of years, almost 1,000 years. So they're much more millennially oriented, thinking that the millennium is the end of the world, right? That in the case of the 12ers, which is the largest sect, they believe the 12th imam will come back, like sort of a messianic figure, and they'll be sort of the end of the world. It's something you don't find Sunnis who think the end of the world might come, just as you find Jews who think that, the Mashiach is going to show up tomorrow, but they're typically, if you go into a mosque and you say that, the end is coming tomorrow, you're going to get some weird looks. For the Shiites, there's much more a sense that the end is for like Seventh-day Adventist Christians or Jehovah's Witnesses, like that, where they believe that it's coming soon. That's 3. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm just curious about the word surahs. It's so close to sutra.
Yeah. I actually don't know etymologically what it means. It means chapter, but I'm not sure what the term
Did
is.
it come? But there's no connection between any of the religions and the language. But sutra and surah is so close.
The languages are not related. Arabic is a Semitic language, unrelated to Sanskrit, and then the religions interacted. So it is entirely possible, but I think unlikely that they would have taken sutra from Buddhist or Hindu sources. Not that there weren't Buddhists and Hindus who were around. They were. I guarantee you, they were Buddhists in Mecca when Islam was being founded, because they were again on trade routes, and the Buddhists also want to make converts. Last question, I think, huh?
Yeah.
Well, I could do a lot of them.
I know. We could be here all night.
Yeah, and
Praying all night.
a clarification, I guess, on the Kaaba or
Yeah, the Kaaba. Yeah.
My understanding of it had been, to simplify it, that basically in Mecca it was almost a tourist attraction. It brought people in for trade, and it was
Pre-Islamic. Yes.
right.
Yeah.
And so that when Muhammad returned,
Yeah.
I had not heard so much about the clearing out the false gods,
Purging,
as
yeah.
much as keeping it so that it would continue to attract traders and
Also
people
equally-
in. And so it was really more how to accommodate than a cleansing.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think it's both. I would agree. Yeah. And that was part of the negotiation, if I recall, when the Meccans surrendered, was to keep the Kaaba. I would have to look at the primary sources or the secondary historiography. I do know purging of the Kaaba is that's a translation of the term which is used in Arabic to refer to what happened. So, but I think they're flip sides of the same thing. One is you obviously you keep it because it's the sacred core of the city and a tourist attraction, but you also can't keep all these idols to foreign gods in there, because as good monotheists who reject idolatry in every form, you can't have that. So you keep the building, but you rededicate it to something else. So I think what you're saying is basically this. I would say it's the same.
Okay.
Yeah. But no, I agree. Absolutely. Yeah, that was, yeah.
Ben, we can't thank you enough. I would be remiss if I did not tell you what's coming up. So you do have Sunday off because it's Mother's Day. So please,
I wanted to see a movie.
go see a movie. Fine. Next Tuesday, a week from tonight, Dr. Alan Moranis is a beloved Musar teacher and the author of the influential book, Everyday Holiness, The Jewish Spiritual Path of Musar, which is like, values and it's very interesting. He's a multifaceted scholar, a Canadian anthropologist, filmmaker, and a writer who has dedicated his career to exploring the depths of Jewish spiritual practice. He's also very good friends with Judith. So please come next week. Also, then the following Sunday is again our own Readers Theater, which means it's our congregants. And Mary Soloff is the director. Can you just give us 2 sentences, Mary? What can we expect on Sunday, May 17th, 9:30 Lox and Bagels, 10 o'clock program?
Practice your oys.
Okay. It's going to be a fun morning. I hope to see you all then. Watch your Macomb at home. There's so much going on. And it's good seeing everybody tonight. And wow, I learned a lot. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. And